How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Catching-101 TV. This is an episode that we've been trying to put together for a while, and scheduling difficulties and conflicts just haven't been able to make it happen. But very excited to have today's guest. As you guys probably know, if you follow me in email or social media, or have ever met you at a camp, I'm an absolute fanboy of All-Star Sporting Goods and their catching equipment and mitts. And I'm lucky enough today to have one of the owners of the family-owned business, Stan Jurga, on the podcast. So, Stan, welcome aboard, man. Glad to have you and sit down and have a conversation.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having us. I mean, likewise, we're big fans of what you do at Catching 101. It's honestly, thank you. This is a big honor. So much appreciated.
Well, it's fun for me. I remember using your guys' gear. It's funny. I think I posted a photo on Instagram not too long ago. When I was in high school, I was decked head to toe in all-star gear. Then when I went to college, they have contracts, and I got away from it for a couple of years. But when I went back to professional baseball, that's what I was using. So I've been a fan of All-Star for a long time. I think one of the cool things about it is it feels like in the catching fraternity or catching brotherhood, like that's what everybody likes. If you talk to any other catching guy, hey, what's your favorite mitt? Oh, it's All-Star. And don't get me wrong, I know there's other brands out there, and there's competition and however you want to word it. But the real catching guys, it seems like everybody uses All-Star. So you guys have done a fantastic job building great products for a long time, and the catching world thanks you for that.
Well, thank you. I mean, we don't pretend that we know everything, and we certainly don't think that we make perfect products for everyone. But we're really rooted in getting that feedback from the player. So like back when our dad was, going into the locker rooms at the pro level, he was just asking guys like in the 70s, like, hey, if you can make catcher's gear, how would you make it? How would you improve what you're wearing right now? And we still do the same thing. Like when my brother Brad or I go to spring training, actually next Monday, we're going to the Arizona Fall League to check in with a lot of the guys out there who are wearing our product. We constantly ask them like, hey, what do you like? But more importantly, what don't you like? Do you have a strap that's bugging you, like on a double header that's kind of cutting into your leg? Is something distracting you? Is something uncomfortable? Like we're constantly asking for constructive criticism, because that's the only way we keep improving the product. It's just an iterative process. We keep tweaking things, trying things, adjusting things, and then listening. So we'll talk to a player maybe down the street at the AAA affiliate for the Red Sox over in Worcester, and say, hey, here's a prototype. What do you think of this? And the catchers might be like, I like this, I don't like this. And then maybe a month or two later, we come back with another sample, like, what do you think of this one? Based on your feedback, we made this change. So it's real simple. I mean, we just listen, and we just try to do a good job of what people need.
Well, you're doing a fantastic job, so keep it up. And now we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. And one of the things that I kind of first hit on is, and something I think is very interesting. So All-Star's a family-owned business. I'm not sure if everyone realizes that. I mean, you guys are everywhere. People see you on TV, and they see you in the sporting goods stores, and they see you, all the catching guys promote you. So I think it would be easy to just guess that it's a huge corporation, just like any other sporting goods manufacturer. But I think it's interesting that you guys are a family-owned company. So if you don't mind, kind of maybe share the genesis story, and then, what your role is, and everybody else who's involved as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, All-Star started with a jock strap back in 1960. And it grew out of basically a classic New England mill building. So we're still in the original building that was built in 1860. So it's kind of old and creaky and rickety and falling apart in areas, but hey, it's home. And but built on the side of a river, used to get all the power off the water wheel. And they were making suspenders and belts, and then also women's corsets and other weird contraptions that we no longer use, thankfully. And then the story is that we were selling belts and suspenders to Sears Roebuck, which most people nowadays are like, Sears what? But you and I are probably old enough to remember like the Sears catalog. It was big, it's basically the Target or the Walmart of the day. And so we were selling belts and suspenders to Sears. They're headquartered in Chicago. We had a sales rep in Chicago who called my grandfather and said, hey, belt sales are great, suspender sales are great, because again, this is the 1960s. And basically Sears had a need to make a jock strap. And so my grandfather said, sure, let's try it, send us some samples. And basically that was basically the very start of All Stars. And we started making jocks for Sears. And then from there, we really went into football products first, like, kind of all different types of pads, thigh pads, knee pads, tail pads, girdles. And then we started doing volleyball knee pads and elbow pads. And it was really in the 70s that we started getting more specialized into the baseball space. again, like what I say with my dad, just kind of going and talking with players. And at first, these catchers are like, wait, why are you talking to me? Because everyone talks to the pitchers or like the big sluggers, not the catchers, like, and so there's an opportunity, to really just kind of improve the product. Because actually one of my favorite stories is Rich Gedman, Geddy on the Red Sox, back in the 80s, early 80s, he's, catcher for the Red Sox, and he joins a team and they give him a set of catcher's gear, and the catcher's gear was red, but the paint was flaking off and it was royal blue underneath. So someone had basically spray painted a pair of leg guards and given it to him. And that was sort of like the state of equipment in the early 80s. It really was the tools of ignorance. It was just like, here, just throw these things on and get out there and go do your job. So really, that's kind of where we found our home, just really kind of working with the ball players. And again, just being totally into like what they need and just trying to make a better product. So, and then, I guess, as you say, the rest is history.
No doubt. That's really cool. So you mentioned earlier, so I know your dad plays a heavy role in All-Star and your brother as well. Specifically, and I've spoken to you and your brother probably more than I've spoken to your dad, even though we've met. But if you don't mind sharing, like, what are kind of your day-to-day responsibilities and what are Brad's day-to-day responsibilities? What do you guys kind of do?
Yeah, totally. So I don't know, I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. Technically, I think I'm the vice president of product development. And, but that's got a little bit, maybe I would say misleading, but it covers a lot. So my day-to-day role really starts in this room, in the test lab. And so we have a full-time test technician, Lewis, who basically 40 hours a week is in here, basically trying to break our product. Whenever we get a new shipment of product in, whether it's batting helmets, catchers helmets, catchers chest protectors, batting helmet face guards, traditional face masks, we're doing a random sampling and bringing it here and testing it. And just as with running any lab, like there's a lot of equipment in here, and sometimes you get some gremlins. And so usually I come in and just check in with Lewis. Hey, how's it going? And usually everything's great. Also, Lewis helped me do a lot of the R&D testing. So either myself or my coworker Austin, who's our head designer, like we might be making some kind of prototype in the next room, and we'll give it to Lewis and have him try to abuse it. And I'll check in with him and say, hey, what are the results like? So a lot of times, like my day really just start down here. I could be down here for 15 minutes. I could be down here all morning before I end up making it upstairs to the office. But also right outside this room is our R&D space that we sort of kind of collectively call the bunker. So it's everything from inbound inspection for quality control, which then ultimately ends up in here. But we also have like a 3D printer. We've got, all their hand tools for basically making prototypes. If we were outside that wall, you would just see a graveyard of just things that we've been testing over the last year or so, just as we make prototypes. But then from there, like my day can go any different direction. I also am the main point of contact with pro players, agents, and major league and minor league equipment managers. So I could be getting a phone call, a text, or emails. Especially like I could be down here with Lewis and I get a text from a guy who says, hey, Stan, I just got called up. I'm flying to, somewhere this afternoon. I need a new set of gear. And so they'll be like, hey, Lewis, I'll see you later. And I'm out basically in the warehouse picking an order, getting it shipped to make sure it's to the player on time. So it really can really span a lot of different things. One moment I could be, have my hands all full of glue from making a prototype. And then next minute I'm talking to a pro MLB player, about who knows what.
Yeah.
So yeah, so cool. It really runs the gamut.
Yeah, you definitely got to keep you on your toes then.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, that's really what keeps us rooted in the product, is that we have very, very short feedback loop from the people who are using our product at the highest levels, abusing it at the most, and then basically being in here working on new products, and then being in communication with our factories, so in our design team here. So, and that's really, again, back to our dad, like that's just what it was. Like he was talking to the players, but he was also making stuff, and trying things out, tinkering with things. And so I'm still doing a lot of that. My brother Brad, he's more on the sales side of things, whether it's working with Dick's Sporting Goods, or the other major retailers out there, working with our independent sales reps. But he too has a hand in a lot of product as well. And it doesn't matter if it's Scott or VP of sales or Austin or Rich, or like we have a bunch of guys here who are all working on product, but we also do other aspects in the company as well. So it's kind of a fun thing. So you're not like just pigeonholed into just doing one thing day in and day out.
I'm sure. Well, it definitely sounds interesting. I appreciate you doing this in the test lab. I didn't mention it earlier. I meant to. You're going to share some interesting things with us a little bit later, which I'm excited to see. I've seen a few
Yeah.
videos that have been posted on social media before, but I feel like we're kind of getting the behind the scenes look at what's goes on at All Star. So definitely appreciate that. Now, I did have something that I wanted to ask you about, something that you kind of mentioned a little while ago, and I just wrote down. You talk about the professional players who are using your gear. And this is something that I feel like I've got a little bit of inside info and I wanted to ask you about because I think it's good information to share with people. I mentioned, and I think if you go and ask your favorite, catching coach or influencer, whatever you want to call it, like I told you, everybody agrees All-Star's the best gear. It's the best looking, it plays the best, it's the best shape, everything. It's just the best. If you turn on the demographics and you watch an MLB game, I'm not exactly sure what percentage of players that are wearing your gear, but I found out a while ago that, and I hope you can expand on it if it's okay. Some of the other companies, they might have really big endorsement deals. And so maybe they gain market share in the big leagues that way, where you guys kind of operate a little bit differently. Is that right?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, again, we're a small independent family business. We're not some big corporation in and of itself. We're not owned by a multinational conglomerate, which quite honestly is the case with all of our competitors, our major competitors anyway. And so on the major league side of things, we go toe to toe with Nike. I mean, there's no hiding it. They have about half of the catchers, many of which are the frontline starting catchers. But we're very different. We focus on providing an exceptional product and great service. And I'll be pretty frank. I mean, we barely pay players anything. In this day and age, a starting catcher is making a handsome sum, more money than I'm making in cash, and certainly more once you throw in all the free product they get from the bigger brands. The scale is like astronomically different in terms of pay. So oftentimes you'll see a player who perhaps makes it to the major leagues the first, second year in All-Star, and you might see him switch to another brand. Oftentimes, I don't want to say 100% of the time, but probably 99.9% of the time, it's because there's a financial compensation being provided from the other side that we just can't compete with. And even if we could shell out these six-figure sums of cash per year to wear basically a logo on a chest, I don't even know if we'd go there because I think our product would suffer, to be honest. Like it keeps us honest, like if the way we retain players is by earning their respect with the quality of the product so they stay healthy and they don't end up on the disabled list, and we give them great service, they send me a text and like they got geared the next day and exactly the way they need it. There's a value to that. And those are the guys we want to work with too. I'm probably saying too much here, but if we're working with, let's say an agent who represents a pro player and I haven't had the opportunity to meet that player yet, but I'm getting the sense from the agent that this player really wants a big financial package or, a lot of merch, I honestly just say, you know what, we're not a good fit, because that just doesn't work with us. We're not going to be able to meet that expectation in a couple of years. But again, like we want to work with other people too, people who really care about their gear, people who are very detailed. I love it when I learn that a player like tweaks things, and fiddles things and adjusts things, because that's how we learn is by hanging out with those guys and seeing what they do and observing. So again, like when you see a guy in All-Star, it's not because we're paying them. I mean, we have a small bonus package based on the number of defensive innings, All-Star game appearance, World Series appearance, et cetera, et cetera. But you really can't even buy a TV with it at the end of the day. It's pretty small. So it's really, you see guys using All-Star product because they believe in what we do and they trust us. And over the years, there have been guys who basically left us for another brand, gone to that brand and basically followed through with that contract, whether it was like, 2, 3, 4 years, and then they finished their career with us because they missed that TLC, they missed the quality of product. I mean, especially when it comes to like leg guards, like guys just rave about how comfortable they are and just how they perform. And so, yeah, so like at the end of the day, that's our job. Like, how do we make a product that's very protective, but essentially seamless, so you don't feel like it's on you, so that you can focus on the game and really earn your salary on the field, not with an endorsement deal.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I wasn't sure if I was allowed to name names or not, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that's kind of how it works. Like I said, if you ask any catching guy, the catching guy's favorite gear is going to be All-Star. I mean, without a doubt, it's the best stuff out there. And I'm not saying this because I'm on here with you. I've said it on social media a number of times. I've said it to anybody who's asked me for the last decade. So I think you're absolutely right. But I do think it gives some just a little bit more background information for maybe somebody who's listening to this and you turn on a big league game and you wonder, well, if it's the best, why is everybody not wearing it? And because there are Nike is a big company. There's other big companies as well.
Yeah, and the other thing is we have a very different philosophy. Like when other brands offer, a sponsorship contract, it's typically a head-to-toe deal. We're very different in the sense that we say, hey, like we want you to use everything from us that we provide, but again, we can't make the perfect thing for everybody. So one example is like Kyle Higashioka on the Yankees. He used to be an all-star, and he used a very, very particular Mizuno mitt. Had a very, very deep pocket. It was like a fringe item from Mizuno. And when I saw it, I was like, Kyle, like, you're not going to like our mitt. I'll let you, you can try it if you want, but in no way should you feel like you have to use our mitt, because our mitt is so much shallower. It's not going to play the way that you're used to. Like, again, this is how you earn your salaries with your mitt, So I want you to be comfortable. And so we have guys that have always been a Rawlings guy as well. And they just stick with it. I always ask them to try, because in that process of them trying it, they'll tell me things that they like, but things that they don't like, or things that they prefer with the other brand. And we can always learn from that opportunity. So we're very low key. Like we never strong arm anyone. We just want them to be comfortable. And again, like the kind of like long-term view is that if that's our relationship with the player, we have to do our job. We have to keep evolving the product, keep making it better to really earn that respect and earn that keep, so they stay with us.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing a good job in the product development side. So I'll thank you on behalf of everybody out there who's listening. And that's a good segue. We're in the test lab, and I want to see that later, but I have a couple other questions about gear specifically that I wanted to ask you as we kind of get into that.
Yeah.
Number one, so one of the biggest questions I see all the time, whether it be in a Facebook message or a Facebook group or a Twitter page or whatever it is, just an email or DM to me, they'll say something along the lines of, hey, Coach Zan, what do you think? What's the difference? What's the real difference between a hockey mask and a traditional mask? I know hockey masks are mandated in a lot of leagues now, but a lot of players still prefer the two-piece mask in the summer league whenever they're available. So if you don't mind, just kind of sharing from all the research you've done from a safety standpoint, what is the difference if there is any? And then maybe, just kind of expand on that.
Yeah, totally. So a couple of things, because we get this question all the time as well. We get this question from parents, from players themselves, from athletic trainers, from coaches, all over the place. And I also like to get out there in front too that we don't have an agenda, because it was our dad and Charlie O'Brien back in the 90s who invented what's now called the hockey style helmet. So we're not like trying to push it. It's just what my job is within the family of All-Star products. I'm here to educate the users on what we know. Stick to the test data and go from there. So the first thing I typically tell a player, parent, or anyone who's asking the difference between a traditional two-piece and a hockey style is, are you worried about backswings? Because if you're worried about getting hit with a bat, there's no question that the hockey style is going to perform better, because you've got coverage along each jaw line, and then because at least again from our family of products, that's the main differentiation. Because when it comes to a frontal impact, anywhere on the front of the mask, forehead, chin, it's kind of splitting hairs saying what's better. And this might get into some of the nuances of testing, and we'll see a little bit here too. But it would be very disingenuous to say one is better than the other, because our values are very low in terms of severity index. And so severity index is basically the total energy of the impact. We also look at the peak force, or the peak G. And in a lot of our products, they're very, very low, even at 100 miles per hour. Now, the equipment that we have here is not very sensitive. It was really built for much higher magnitude impacts, because NOxI, who sets the safety standards for a lot of the helmets that are in use and the new chest protector standard, their main motivation with helmets was skull fractures. And that skull fracture has a pretty high energy level of 1,200 SI. And a lot of our values, we're not allowed to publish them. I can talk about them a little bit, but we're not allowed to publish them and rank things per all the agreements that manufacturers have with NOxI. It just stipulates that, which makes a lot of sense, because sometimes when you get down to the lower values, so some of our products are in the teens or the 20s, the 30s, even some single digits, even at 100-mile-per-hour impacts, the equipment just is not that sensitive. So statistically speaking, if you go to an independent lab like Southern Impact Research Center, Chesapeake, ICS Labs out in Ohio, they all have a measurement of their variation in testing. And that's all basically roughly around 50 SI, which basically means that any two numbers that are within 50 SI of each other are essentially equivalent. So back to our product, if you are shooting our hockey style catcher's helmets, at velocities and using those same velocities and same locations on a traditional two-piece, you're going to see that those numbers are definitely much tighter than 50 SI. So it's really, and to be perfectly honest, it's really hard to say that one is better than the other. I think there's also a big misconception out there that there's a way to prevent concussions, and there is not. There's no science that says that if we do something, we can prevent a concussion. It's a very complex problem. And really, to describe it simply, is you think about your brain being kind of jello. It's very soft tissue. You got two hemispheres. And the old belief was that a concussion was a brain bruise. You get hit in the head, and your brain basically whacks the inside of the skull, and you have some injury here. That's not really factual any longer. What we know is that rotational accelerations, like a whiplash motion, are much more damaging. And so when you start rotating your head, because there's two hemispheres kind of split down the middle, you get these torsional modes. And there's really no helmet outside of a force field around your whole head. There's really nothing that's—
When's that coming out? That's what I wanted. That's what the people want to know. When are you coming out with that?
2 years from now, we'll be rolling that out.
Yeah.
But an example I give, we're just outside of Boston in Massachusetts, and a couple of years ago, I'm losing track of time, it's probably more like 5 years ago, Brock Holt had a concussion. He basically kind of, I think, stumbled on the infield during a play. His head never hit the ground, but he was out for about a month with a concussion. And it's all because of this whiplash motion, even though there's no direct impact to the head. So concussions are very hard, and there's some rules of thumb out there that I won't get into right now, but those are all for a single impact, and what your risk. There are risk profiles based on a single impact. If you're below a certain G level, your risk of concussion, is deemed lower or higher. And a lot of our products are just, even our introductory helmets are very low on that scale. But again, it's really hard to make comparative studies that are factual based just on the limitations of the test equipment that we have here. And that's true across the entire industry. There's no other way that I know of to basically test, helmets. So yeah, we're always learning. We're always going to concussion conferences. In pre-COVID, we'd be going to about 2 or 3 concussion conferences per year. We work with Dr. Robert Cantu, who's down the street in Concord. He's one of the foremost experts on sports-related concussions and CTE. So, we're always just trying to learn, because it's important to what we do. But there's no question, we're always trying to drive the energy lower, because common sense just says that's that makes sense, right? Yeah. So, to paraphrase, I really boil it down just to backswings. That's the main thing. And on the major league side, we're seeing more and more backswings year over year for various reasons.
Let me ask you 2 follow-up questions with that.
Yeah.
One, I would say I try to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on. I can absolutely miss things. I would say in the past year, I know 20 was a shortened season, but over the past 2 years, it seems like there have been very few concussions in catchers versus, I would say, it seemed like from 2014 or 15, maybe until 19. I don't want to say it was regular, but you absolutely read about it. You would see about guys going on the injured list or guys missing playing time because of it. Is that just a coincidence, or has anything changed recently? Because guys
Yeah,
are throwing harder, you know?
yeah, they are. Absolutely. That's a great question, Zan. So this is just my instinct and gut. I honestly think, so you're absolutely right. This year, there was only 3 catchers in the major leagues that had concussions. You basically had Cam Gallagher, you had Andrew Knapp, and Jacob Stallings. There was also Max Stassi and Austin Hedges, but Austin Hedges would hit with a pitch ball while at bat, and then Max Stassi, I think, hit a pole while chasing a pop fly. Mm-hmm. But in terms of foul tips and backswings, it was basically like Jacob Stallings wears our helmet. He wears our MVP 4000. His injury, and this is really important for people to understand too, because a lot of times it's not a single impact that results in a concussion. Mm-hmm. It's oftentimes multiple impacts, and typically within a short period of time. So in the case of Jacob, he took, I believe, a bat swing to the side of the head first, felt fine, felt asymptomatic, kept on playing, played for another couple of days, and then he took a foul tip. And he even finished that game, I believe, and felt totally fine, passed, some tests. But then the next day started feeling not quite himself. And that's very common with concussions. So sometimes the symptoms really don't arise until hours, maybe even a day later. And also, again, like in the context of baseball, it tends to be multiple foul tips within a day or two of each other. And that's based on speaking with experts like Lonnie Soloff on the Cleveland Indians, where they track a lot of foul tips. They try to map it out in terms of different regions. Like, is there one location more prevalent than others that leads to a concussion? And they said, no, it's typically clusters of impacts. It doesn't really matter where you hit. Because a lot of times we talk about chin shots, and chin shots really make sense because, again, back to your head spinning, your chin's a nice lever that can force your head in different directions to get that rotational motion. I also think that we think about chins a lot because compared to hitting your forehead, which is more or less solid bone up here, your chin has all kinds of muscles and ligaments. So you definitely feel it more because you haven't just jolted your head, you jolted a lot of other connective tissue along the way, which you're going to feel for an injury. I still haven't answered your question though. So there's definitely been a drop this year compared to past years. But just like most years, I think a lot of people equate concussions with catchers in baseball. It's actually outfielders. And this is true at the NCAA level too. Like there's more outfielders who suffer concussions year over year than catchers. It's just collisions with other players, hitting their head on the ground, hitting the wall or the fence. So they're the ones that they're more exposed, quite honestly. The reason I think that there's a drop this year, and granted, this is just 1 year, and concussion is such a hard thing to measure, and there's so many factors like dehydration and all kinds of things, past history, but I think it has a lot to do with one knee down, and that basically by getting lower, you're basically out of the fan angle of the foul tips, and this all goes back to Alex Avila. So Avila, for many years, used a traditional two-piece from another brand. He was not doing well. He had multiple concussions, and it got to a point where he was really starting to wonder about what's the future going to look like. I just can't keep taking hits like this. So working with him and his athletic trainer at the time, Kevin Rand, this is back on Detroit Tigers, we did a couple of things. One is that he switched to the hockey style helmet, and we put in some extra padding. And I'm very honest with people, we can put in some extra padding. It reduces the SI a little bit, but again, it's like on the order of magnitude of doing a jumping jack. So it's measurable, it's repeatable, but, is it really matter? We don't know. We just don't. There's a lot of things we don't know. But he also started using our Cryo Helmet, which is a whole other topic for another time, probably, Zan, but it's basically cold packs for the head and neck. And we have a peer-reviewed study done out in New Zealand with rugby players. And the short answer, or the short version, is that putting ice in your head and your carotid arteries basically drops your brain temperature by a few degrees. And when that happens, it heals better, or just heals faster, heals more naturally, and the symptoms basically dissipate. And that's just been a big tool that a lot of people use. So Alex started using it proactively. And there's no factual basis for this. This is our hypothesis. There's no research yet, because this is a really hard thing to study, is that, we know that a concussion is really a gradient. And, and everyone's different. Everyone has a different threshold. And that threshold is basically where you start to feel symptoms, because there's no test for a concussion. I mean, they're still working on it, trying to get a blood test, but ultimately a concussion is a subjective analysis or a subjective evaluation by a medical expert who's going to ask you questions, trying to judge your memory, try to see your symptom load, whether you have, you're starting to develop a migraine headache, whether you feel dizzy, nauseous, if you're having inability sleeping. Like they're trying to collect all this information subjectively to try to make a decision on whether or not your brain has had an injury. So that's basically where you start having symptoms, is everyone's threshold, or at that threshold, and everyone's threshold is different. And that's something that came out, Dr. Cantu spoke about, the last concussion conference we went to was in June of 2019, I believe. Yeah, June 2019. And that's what he was saying, is like the biggest research reveal in concussion research is that we've always known that we're different. I can hit you and me the exact same way, and we're gonna have probably two very different responses to that head blow. But we've known that for many decades. But what's new is that disparity between people is much larger than we ever thought. We thought maybe we were kind of within, this much, but now we're like, whoa, like it can be very, very different just based on genetics, again, your past history with head trauma, all kinds of things. So where was I going with this, Zan? I'm going down this big, deep rabbit hole of concussions. Alex Avila. So basically our hypothesis is that if you use cooling on your head and your neck to bring your brain temperature down, when you get a foul tip, you're kind of getting some amount of trauma. And once you get enough trauma, like after multiple foul tips, for instance, you're over that threshold. So what if you intercede with cooling and you kind of basically are able to kind of come back, because naturally, like you take a foul tip, in a couple of days, you're going to come back to your baseline. Mm-hmm. Another foul tip, and you're going to come back to your baseline. But we're hoping that with cooling, you accelerate that return to your baseline. And Alex swears by it, Kirk Casale swears by it, Stephen Vogt. I mean, there's so many major league catchers who are using the Cryo Helmet just kind of proactively. But again, like we at this point have no science that says that it works for that application. We just have research that shows it helps with your recovery if you do have a concussion. So that was the second thing Alex did, is, basically first thing, switch to a hockey style helmet, start using the Cryo Helmet on a regular basis, even when he feels normal after a foul tip. And then the third thing is that he started getting low, and it's really simple. Again, it's the fan angle. And if you can avoid an impact right from the start, that's the best defense, is just avoidance. And so by getting lower, you're just, again, less probability of getting hit by a foul tip. So my gut's telling me that we're getting that with the drop knee stance. Everyone is getting lower, by getting on one knee. There could also be some other stuff too, where just being in a one knee stance, your whole body's more stable. And that's good, because we know from research, there's about, I think, 3 or 4 different peer-reviewed research papers that show a correlation between neck strength and your risk of a concussion. So essentially, like the weaker your neck is, the easier it is to flop around, mm-hmm. and your likelihood of developing concussion, or your risk of concussion, is higher. Doesn't matter what sport, could be soccer, basketball, lacrosse. That's what they're seeing, this correlation between neck strength and your risk of concussion. So I've been advocating for years that guys should be doing, neck strengthening, especially in the off season, and then throughout the season too. So a couple years ago, we sent out all of our contract guys a simple product called Shingo Amara. It's basically rubber bands, like big TheraBands, and a strap that you put on your head. And it's great because and Zan, you work out a lot. You've probably seen like Iron Neck by any chance. Yeah. Have you ever seen that?
Oh yeah.
So I mean, it's amazing, right? You get this huge disc you mount on your head, and you're like doing all kinds of neck extensions and twists and rotations, but you need a gym to do it. Mm-hmm. So this whole Shingo Amara thing, which I think is Swahili for like strong neck, I think that's what it is. But these yellow rubber bands, it's great because it's not that expensive. It travels, and all the minor league guys and major league guys are constantly living out of a suitcase. And it's just real simple. You basically take the rubber bands, hold it against a wall, and you can start doing all kinds of rotations and dips and all kinds of things. Really simple. And again, based on research, it works. But back to the one knee stance, I feel like maybe when you're dropping a knee, your whole body is just more stable versus being in a 2-point where maybe it's just, you're just naturally less balanced. And so something kind of maybe is going to rotate a little bit easier than when you're kind of more firm and kind of even more aggressively leading forward as well. All hypothesis, just our thoughts.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I knew we were going to talk about concussions at some point today, just going over masks and talking about being in the test lab. I didn't know we were going to talk about the one knee down stance. So that's interesting. That may very well be an unintended consequence. So yeah, so pretty cool. Well, so let me ask you one more follow-up about that. And then we'll kind of move on to the next subject. And I just want to make sure this is perfectly 100% crystal clear for everybody who's listening, because I know a lot of parents of youth players might have a question. So from a head-on impact, from a foul tip impact, there's basically going to be no difference between a hockey style and traditional helmet. The only benefit of the hockey style is, for the most part, going to be on a backswing, because it's providing more protection around the rest of the head.
Absolutely. And there's one thing that I should point out too. Let me grab a prop to show you. So like there's a lot of kind of, I think, well-intentioned pseudoscience out there. Is that with a traditional two-piece, there's this talk about, with it blowing off your face, there's less energy getting into your head. And so years ago, we studied that. Like, is that actually true? Because it all comes down to physics. You got this ball that's coming at your head, and that ball has kinetic energy. Once that ball makes contact with you, there's a certain amount that's getting transmitted into the system, being basically the helmet or face mask in your head. Now, if that ball is deflected away, that's carrying some of that energy away, but it's still transmitted some amount of energy, into the head. So that's kind of the first thing we do, is we look at basically, how do we make, product kind of more aerodynamic so that we can kind of deflect more of that energy away. But once you've made contact and the mask is compressing, you're getting all that energy transferring into the head in less than 10 milliseconds. It's a blink of an eye. And so in the instances where we've simulated an off-center shot to make the mask blow off the head form, what you see, like, we've got a clear window up here. So we have a high-speed camera that looks down, we have a high-speed camera that looks to the front. And what you clearly see when you look down is that the mask is basically completely, even though it's spinning off your face, it's completely loading, and it's actually on the rebound off of your face that is spinning away. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, the reason it's kind of blowing to the side of your face is that the mask is getting compressed, coming off the head form, off your face, and because this is on an elastic, it's actually slinging around off the elastic. It's really not blowing off your face. It's basically already compressed fully, unloaded, and then it's coming off. So it's amazing what you see with high-speed camera when you slow it down. So I like to get that kind of mythbuster-ish type of thing out of the way too. Like, that's it sounds really good, but it factually is not correct. Just because it happens so fast, all the loading. Yeah. So, but again, in terms of the All-Star products, like, they're really similar. This is our magnesium mask. I mean, I do tell people this is our lightest, best testing mask, and that is factual. This does get the lowest SI, the lowest peak G. It's slightly lower than our steel masks, and it's definitely lighter than our steel masks. But again, like, I'm not going to go out and say it's any kind of percentage better than our steel masks, which are tried and true and get really, really low SI as well. Or the same thing, compared to our hockey style helmets. It's just in the noise of the measurement, unfortunately.
That's interesting, because I think one of the questions that's always been in a lot of people's mind is, like, you're talking about the mask leaving the head. Another aspect that people think about is the weight of the mask. I remember speaking to Charlie O'Brien. It's been about 10 years, but the first hockey mask was very, very heavy. And there's a lot of different, I don't know if qualities or different levels or types of masks. There's very, very light, and there's heavier. Is there any difference in the weight of the mask, how that plays in that?
So this is a really, really important thing, Zan, is that let's talk about titanium, because there's a lot of talk about titanium being dangerous because it's so light. And that, again, that kind of makes sense based on what we know with physics, right? Like, if you're driving down the highway, right, and you get into an accident, do you want to be in a Mini Cooper or a Mack truck? You want to be in the heavier thing that has more mass, and that makes a lot of sense. But that's a huge magnitude, scale in terms of difference of mass. When we're talking about, like, titanium to steel, it's only a couple of ounces. It's really not significant. People will say, like, well, back, like, in the 60s and 70s, and even before, like, no one had concussions. It's got to be because the masks are getting lighter and lighter. And it's like, well, yeah, but not really. We know more now. Like
Yeah.
we don't say, hey, you got your bell rung, get back in there, rub some dirt on it. Like we're much more sensitive to it and aware, have much higher awareness. So we've done studies where we've taken our steel mask. This is our magnesium again, but we have a steel mask that's like the traditional kind of upside down U shape, very classic look, and we have a titanium version, and then we also have the solid steel version, like the old solid steel version. So we have like very different weights. Very different. Again, it's small. It's basically like maybe a 6 ounce difference between the solid steel and the hollow steel that we currently use, and then maybe another 2 ounces lighter to get to the titanium. And really, weight does not come into the equation much at all. Certainly up against 100-mile-per-hour impact. It's really the stiffness of the alloy. So the problem with titanium is not that it's light, it's that it's so stiff, it just doesn't bend. So, steel is great because with a big enough impact, it'll bend. Back to what I said earlier with conservation of energy. You've got this ball with kinetic energy, it's making contact. That energy has to go somewhere. And our hope is that our system absorbs it and dissipates it before it reaches your skull. And so basically with steel and also with this magnesium, with a big enough hit, you're going to bend the metal. And if you think about taking a bar of metal, it takes energy to bend it permanently and to form it. And so that's sucking up energy that would otherwise get into the pads and then perhaps pass the pads into your head. So I like things that bend. I'd rather give a pro player or a person from the general public a new replacement mask of steel, knowing it's done its job. And this is really not very different from bicycle helmets that are made to break on impact, because that EPS material basically fractures. And same thing, when you fracture material, it doesn't fracture by itself. It takes energy to fracture it. So that's what sucks up the energy. Same thing, motorcycle helmets are made for one impact only because they crack on impact. And then you and I are probably old enough to remember this, but the Volvo Crumple zone, Volvo paid tons of money to have these commercials on TV showing the front end of their car, hitting a wall, and the whole front was just crumpling in. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea is that you're crumpling that metal and sucking up energy before it gets to the driver. And so that's just the physics of what's going involved. So titanium is not great because it's so stiff. Back when we first started doing titanium, and this is probably, again, a story that is maybe I need to abbreviate here, Zan, because I have full of stories and I go down these rabbit holes, but we did not offer titanium for a long time. Another brand by the name of Nike came out with titanium, and we had some players say, "Hey, how come you're not making a tie traditional mask?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Like we have tie for hockey style. Like our hockey style helmet, at that time we had a titanium frame, and on the hockey style helmet there really was no measurable difference whether we had titanium as the face mask, solid steel, hollow steel. We even had aluminum at one point." Those alloys, in the context of having either a fiberglass shell or a plastic shell, plus more padding than you have in a two-piece, basically there's really no change in the measurements of how much energy got into the head, whether it was tie, steel, hollow steel, or aluminum. But my gut was telling me that it's the wrong material for a traditional mask. And so I said that because out of all those materials, I could hit titanium at 100 miles per hour several times, and you wouldn't know it was impacted. It was so stiff and rigid, it just did not bend. So in my gut, when you're putting on less padding, there's no plastic shell to help, again, disperse that impact, it just felt wrong in my gut. I was at spring training many years ago, and Austin Romine was a minor leaguer in the Yankee system, and he was in our gear that year, and it was the last year that he was in our gear, and he told me, he said, how come you don't, well, he said, well, how come you have a titanium mask? I explained the whole thing I just explained to you, and he just looked at me and said, I don't care, I think you're behind Nike. And I was like, ooh, like that hurts. And so I got home from spring training, and a few weeks later, I was working on the titanium mask. Now, the other part is, I'd be dishonest if I said how bad titanium is, and then you look at our website and you see that we sell titanium. The alloy is only part of the story, because you have the pads here as well that are part of the system. So when I started prototyping the titanium mask, yeah, like it really did not bend much at all. and we found that it was loading the pads more. And so we had to basically augment and kind of put almost like sports suspension in a Jeep, kind of augment the pads a little bit better. Because if your pads, there's a sweet spot. It all goes back to the numbers that you get out of the test lab, is that it's a whole system. So like if the mask is really stiff and the pads are too soft, you're basically going to bottom out and get the bars on your chin. And I won't name any brands, but that's happened. One of our players, Chris Jimenez, used to use a different player, former Major League player, Chris Jimenez, who used our gear for a long time, he used another brand, and those pads are really, really soft. And he had a couple foul tips that basically, he felt the cage bottom out on his chin. Not good. On the flip side, if you go too stiff, then it's basically a stiff frame with stiff pads, and it's like getting hit with a brick, So you need to do, a series of testing to really kind of find that happy spot where you're basically managing the energy in the appropriate way. So we do offer a titanium mask, and maybe I'm a frugal New Englander, but I get these questions from parents saying, hey, your titanium mask is the most expensive mask you sell. It must be the best. And I want to get it for my elite travel ball player. Do you recommend it? And I'm like, well, don't spend your money on it. Like, buy the steel. The steel is only 2 ounces heavier. It's not that big of a difference in weight. It's way cheaper. And honestly, like, I just feel steel's better for a protective mask. But you got to build what people want. And there's a lot of people who want titanium. And even though I'm saying that we can measure a difference in titanium being a higher SI than our steel, it's really not a dramatic difference. So on average, like our steel masks get maybe like a 25 SI, again, depending on where you hit it, and this is like 100 miles per hour, kind of ballpark, whether it's eye socket, nose, forehead, chin, you're getting maybe like a 25 SI. And our titanium, same frame design, just different alloy, gets more like a 50 SI on average. And you can say, oh my gosh, like going from 25 SI to 50 SI is like double the energy. That's like twice as bad. And like, I should not use the titanium. But you have to put that in context. Couple things. One, I mentioned that the independent labs, any two numbers within 50 SI statistically are really equivalent, just because the equipment's not that sensitive and there's variation. But the other thing is that the threshold that NOXI sets is 1,200. So when you compare like the 50 SI of a titanium mask to the 1,200 SI threshold for NOXI, we're far below that. And I mentioned earlier, there's some rules of thumb about risk of concussion. There's some researchers out there that say, like, if you're under 300 SI, your risk of concussion is low. If you're under 100 SI, it's very low. Again, like, I always feel like as a parent, and, like, you want what's best for your kids, go with the lowest thing, and just, steel is great. It's more economical as well. And the salespeople in our company are probably going to hate me for saying this, but that's just the honest feeling I have.
No, that's great info. And I'm with you. All this stuff is super interesting to me. I think we could have had an entire podcast just on masks. I do have some other things I want to ask you about, because I find that very interesting. A couple of times already has come up is NOXI. And that's a term that I've gotten a little more familiar with over the past couple of years. I know you're unbelievably familiar with it. I feel like a lot of parents are having to become familiar with it because they're having to go out and buy new gear as some of these standards change. So if you don't mind, I'd love to hear just kind of how do the NOXI standards work, and then maybe explain a little bit more about that specifically with your guys' gear.
Yeah, absolutely. So NOXI is an organization that is set up to establish safety standards for sporting goods equipment. Their charge is to develop standards based on science. And typically what happens is an organization approaches them. It could be Little League, could be NCAA, NFHS, USA Lacrosse, even the NFL. Like, an organization will approach them and say, hey, we have this injury. And can you do some research and figure out how we can maybe lower the probability of that happening? Because again, you can't make all injuries go to zero. That's just, not true. I mean, you're just trying to lower the risk, lower the probability. So they'll look at research. They have a budget that they'll send out grants, to different researchers. And based on that research, they may or may not be able to come up with a standard. So the most recent standard, which is probably a good example to talk about, is the Commotio Cordis standard. And so Dr. Link, who used to be down the street at Tufts University, he's now, I think, at Rice University in Texas, I think. But anyway, he's a cardiologist. has basically been looking at this a very rare condition called commotio cordis, where I'm sure you and your audience are familiar with this, that you get hit over the heart at just the wrong time. There's like a very, very small microsecond window during the T, during your heart's rhythm, there's something called the T wave. You have to get hit at just that time of the T wave. And basically you have a heart attack. Your body just goes into fibrillation. And the only way to basically survive, because it's binary, you're either going to survive or die. The only way to survive is if you get the paddles onto your chest and shock your heart back into a better rhythm. The good news, now that I've kind of cast gloom and doom, the good news is that over the last 10 years, more people are surviving it than are not surviving it. It's better awareness, especially on the coaches. There's different coaches who have to go through training to kind of acknowledge what it is or recognize what it is. And then the biggest thing is the availability of automatic defibrillators. So you see AEDs all over the place at stadiums, on field. A lot of athletic trainers have them in the wagon with them. So getting the paddles onto the player faster is tremendously advantageous to having them survive. So what Dr. Link was doing is, in his lab, he had a bunch of juvenile swine, basically small pigs, that are a good analog to a 14-year-old boy. Because when you look at the injury data over about 40 years, you see some common things. This typically happens to males. It's very, very rare for females. And in the context of baseball, it's really around age 14 plus or minus a few years. Once you go above age 18, you really just don't see this happening in baseball at all. So they took these juvenile swine and basically started impacting right over the heart to really understand, how do we trigger this? And they found that it's a window. There's really like a window between, more or less 50 miles per hour and 70 miles per hour where this occurs. And excuse me, between 30 miles per hour and 50 miles per hour is where this typically happens. It's a very, very kind of narrow window, which correlates with that age range. Like, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old boys are not throwing, 80, 90 mile per hour balls, So based on the injury observations, based on the experiments on the pigs, they're like, hey, that's kind of the window of where it is. So Noxie was funding this research with Dr. Link, and basically found that there's a certain amount of force. And once you go above that level of force, that's when commotio cordis is triggered. So what happened was, from that research, then it went to Nate Dow. And Nate Dow was doing this PhD thesis and basically built a mechanical surrogate for those pigs. And if I turn the camera here, it might be a little shaky. Give me 1 second. You'll see our surrogate up in the corner over here. It's kind of over the, let's see if I can point, like right there.
Yeah.
Our Noxie surrogate. And so basically that's what Nate Dow built is, and again, that was, I think, partly funded by Noxie. And then because, it's all well and fine to test product on pigs, but we can't test pigs here because you have to feed them and do all kinds of things to maintain their health. And then you got to turn them into bacon, once you've impacted them a couple times, So, but then, so basically Nate built a mechanical surrogate, and that's basically what we and the independent test labs and other brands basically are using to develop product to do quality control testing on. So that was all basically funded by Noxie. And kind of out of that, basically Noxie says, all right, well, based on this research, based on this mechanical surrogate over here, they developed basically a protocol, based on, how to impact it, what velocities, what the different thresholds are. So that kind of, in a nutshell, is what Noxie does. They're told, hey, there's an injury out there. They study that injury. They try to find smart people out there who can research it and find a solution. If a solution is found, then they build a standard to basically say to us manufacturers, this is what you got to do if you want to meet the standard. And I should be clear too, is that the standards that Noxie developed really don't have a lot of weight until an organization adopts it. So for instance, years ago, some people approached Noxie and said, hey, pitchers in baseball are getting hit with comebackers. Can you develop a standard for basically a pitcher's helmet, a defensive baseball helmet? And Noxie did that. And they came up with a standard. And not to my knowledge, there's not a single brand who's making a product that meets that standard, because largely there's no organization who says it's mandatory. So we as manufacturers don't jump mostly until there's an organization that says, hey, we're going to mandate this. Does that kind of explain kind of how NOxI works and how they interact with the different governing bodies and us manufacturers?
Absolutely. And like I said, I know there's been a lot of families and high school players that I've spoken to recently that they're all asking for new chest protectors because there's these new standards in place, and I guess their high school, I don't know if it's adopted by state or if it's just the overall high school, but there's a lot of guys who are having to get the new gear.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first group that rolled it out was the National Federation of High Schools, the NFHS. And that basically affects, I think, 48 out of the 50 states. There's only, I think, 2 states that go by NCAA rules for high school versus NFHS rules. So they basically first adopted it. And then the following year, the NCAA adopted, but then they ended up delaying it a year. But basically, starting last year in 2020, the NCAA also adopted it, which, I mean, I'm probably saying things I shouldn't say here, but based on the injury data, it doesn't make sense for the NCAA to require it. Because again, like I said, above age 18, the chance of chlamydia course in baseball happening to a player is very low. And I think what the researchers believe it is that at that age, you've got denser bone structure over the cardiac wall. You also typically have more musculature over as well. And those all help to basically deaden the blow of how much pressure and force is getting into the heart. It's still curious to us why Little League hasn't adopted it, because they're kind of in that sweet spot of the age range. Don't know why. And this thing is interesting too, Zan, because I think the standards has good intentions, but when we as engineers look at the data, over 40 years they've been tracking commotio cordis by sport, and it's true that baseball has more commotio cordis than other team sports. And there's been about 400 or so players that's been documented. And certainly it's happened more than that, but in the instance of documented cases, it's been about 400 or so players. But when you look at by position, there's only been three catchers in 40 years that have had this. It's largely base runners, batters, and pitchers and infielders who are suffering commotio cordis. But that's just what it is, and it's why we offer kind of like an actual heart guard. I mean, a lot of companies offer heart guards, but they're not really certified to the standard. But we have one that is.
No, well, I appreciate you clearing that up. Like I said, I know I've got questions about it, and it's something that I'm familiar with, but I wouldn't say I'm very knowledgeable in it. And I feel like there's probably a lot of families out there who also can gain some knowledge from that. So definitely appreciate you sharing. And I want to be respectful of your time. There's still a lot of other things I want to see. I kind of want to get to what I'm going to call the fun part of the show, where you get to show us kind of the stuff.
Yes, exactly.
I know you're in the test lab, and I'd love to see, a couple demonstrations. Just show me around what you do.
Yeah, totally. So we'll use the air cannon with basically the head form, and that's kind of like our fundamental piece of equipment for assessing traditional face masks, hockey style helmets, batters helmets, batting helmet face guards, and even basically we bring the NOxI thoracic surrogate down for chest pressure testing as well. So this is like a really important piece. So let me move some things around, and I should first kind of start here with basically the NOxI head form. So NOxI basically makes these head forms for us. They're biofidelic or biomimetic in the sense that they're like a normal human head in terms of shape and size. So we have 3 different sizes. This is the large, basically kind of football linebacker or lineman head, size 8 melon. Very, very heavy, just like a normal human head. Over here, this is our youth head form. So this is like a 90th percentile, I think like 10-year-old or thereabouts. And then they're biofidelic in the sense that just like the normal human head, they're more sensitive on the sides versus the forehead and the back. So they really try to mimic what happens in the real world. If you cut this thing open, what you would see is that the entire cranium is filled with a viscous oil. Again, back to like our heads being kind of like jello. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like trying to be this gelatinous, sloshing around of our brain. And then right up through this portion right here, we basically put an accelerometer up into the center of mass to measure the force, and like the peak force, and also the thing called the severity index that I keep mentioning, which is not exactly, but pretty much I can get really nerdy about this and the equation, the integral of this, but in practical terms, it's more or less the total energy of the impact. So it's a really important thing. I could bring a whiteboard out and kind of show you all these things, but in the interest of time, we'll kind of skip over that for now. we'll just get to the fun stuff of whacking things. So, so what we'll do is just grab. This is a youth. Again, youth head form. This is a youth hockey style helmet, and we just simply mount it on, and the head form and neck basically can rotate and tip in different ways, and we can drop out this pointer. This is basically where we're going to shoot, and let's see. Let's shoot the nose right there. Back. And it's really like a muzzle loader. We basically have this compressed air tank that's probably out of the view of the camera. We've got this big muzzle here, and we basically put the ball right inside, plunger it right down, and I'm going to grab some ear protection because this is really loud. Sure. And for you too, Zan, like I'm not sure how it comes across with the microphone, but it's really loud.
Okay.
So we'll do is we'll close this up, and the other couple of things too is that we have the velocity meter over here to measure the velocity. I can kind of zoom in on that in a second. And we have this computer over here called the KME that basically looks at the accelerometer, pulls out the peak force, and it also does a severity index calculation as well. So we'll reset that and reset this. It'll just kind of show it before and after. So this might be a little shaky. And bring this over, and here is the KME. So we're reset to 0. That's going to measure again the peak force and the severity index. It might be kind of hard to see, but we're armed on the air cannon. Mm-hmm. And then let me put this back because I'll need my hands. All right, and then I'll give it. I'll just say 3, 2, 1, then I'll pull the trigger.
Sounds good.
All right. So 3, 2, 1. All right. So that came out at, let's see. Again, I'm not too sure if you can see the velocity meter, but basically more or less 99 miles per hour, good. Just shy of 100. And the severity index is 12. Oh, wow. So very, very low number, which is great because again, like the NOxie threshold is 1,200. And the peak G is 34. And the peak G is interesting. And again, I can be really nerdy about this, but people might be like, man, 34 peak G, that sounds awful, because I think fighter pilots in the Air Force pass out at 4 Gs. And so you're like, 34 Gs, that sounds awful. But the reality is that this is 34 Gs in less than 10 milliseconds, just like that. Whereas an Air Force pilot is going around a big curve at sustained 4 Gs, and that's when they pass out. So it's like just a very, very different type of acceleration, if you will. Sure. So then now kind of what I was saying is that steel is great because with a big enough impact you will get some bending, and so that definitely took a pretty big impact. Which again, this is a youth helmet that we just shot at roughly 100 miles per hour, got a really low SI, and yeah, it's bent. But I'd rather have a cage bend and then, know a player's got less energy going into the head. And in practical terms, we never see this. Even from major league players, we never see this level of deformation. So what we do here in the lab oftentimes is worst case analysis, because we're hitting absolutely perpendicular, to the product. No grazing angles, like just straight on is for maximum energy transfer. And that's really the way it should be, right? I mean, we should be really going to the extremes to really try to deliver the most force we can, so that in the real world, the probability of that happening is even less. So yeah. Any questions about what you just saw?
No, I mean, that's really cool. I mean, I know you have the mask and you test the hockey style and the traditional. Do you also test the chest protectors in a similar way?
Yeah, totally. So let's see if I can.
And you don't. I'm not. Stan, I'm not. You don't have to pull everything out. I'm just curious about.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So, and that's one of the things with managing a lab is that, we've got a bunch of product out there that's kind of in the queue to get pulled in. And so in this room, it's temperature controlled. It's got to be 72 degrees plus or minus 5. So Lewis will bring in, a batch of helmets with these big racks of, for batting helmets, catcher's helmets. Same thing for chest. Actually, he's kind of taking a hiatus from chest protectors. Like we just got a new shipment in, but he's actually got some laid out here for quality control. It's probably about a dozen or so.
Sure.
And so, yeah, so like it all goes through here. It's all sees all different types of testing. And sorry, Zan, this is all bouncing all over the place. But yeah, so it's anything that has to meet the NOxy standard is running through here. And this is our quality control testing. So this is what we're doing to make sure that our product is living up to how we designed it. You know, we've got golden samples outside this room of like what the product should be. We do third-party testing every year that's required of NOxy. So every one of our models has to be sent to an independent lab to basically verify the results that we get in here. Every year we're audited. So we have an auditor from SCI, and that's a whole other area where NOxy sets the safety standards, but they're not the policeman. There's another organization called Safety Equipment Institute, or SEI, who basically is a third-party entity that makes sure that we, as manufacturers, are complying with the NOxy standard. So that means that our factories are audited every year. We're audited every year. They look at all of our test data to make sure we're in compliance. And there's a ton of data. I mean, because like, especially when we do catcher's helmets, I mean, we've only talked about the air cannon, but right over here is the drop rig. We'll spin this around and hopefully not getting dizzy. So kind of down here is what we call the drop rig. And this is meant to simulate getting hit with a baseball bat. So we have this round anvil right here that we put down onto the orange stand. And the head form will basically put a helmet on the head form. And this head form goes on this vertical rail. So we pull this up to a prescribed height. We have to impact us at 14 feet per second. And then we have to hit a different location. So we'll spin the head form around. We can tilt it in different ways. And it all basically falls onto that metal anvil. And this is, we got a moment. I'd like to show you something else, Dan, that we did. And this is something where, you know, I take a lot of pride in that we try to, I think, to put it simply, we care compared to other brands. And that's one reason why we tend to excel at, you know, functionality, but also safety. Because when I'm the guy who's like talking to, you know, Martin Maldonado or Jose Trevino or any of our pro players, and I'm giving them a new product or even existing product, I want to know that it really works. You know, we're a family business, and at the end of the day, like, I don't want to sell a product or give a product to a pro player that I wouldn't wear myself, or that I wouldn't have my daughters wear, or have my brother wear. My brother's a different story, actually. So, but yeah, so it's basically systemically that we care. And so one thing that we've seen over the years, especially the last 5 years, is more and more guys are getting hit with bat swings. So, you know, I talk with players, I say, I think it's because guys care about home runs more. They don't care about hitting for average. So there's bigger windup, bigger follow through. And then with the advent of more analytics, looking at launch angle, guys are swinging more upwards at the ball, which ultimately means you're coming down on the catcher more than, you know, being a planar swing. And then talking with guys like Luke Maley and some other pro catchers who've come through Fenway a couple years ago when we first started kind of honing in on this, they said, yeah, it's true. I mean, batters are definitely trying to hit more home runs. Yeah, that launch angle thing's a factor. But they're saying that catchers are at fault for getting hit more with a bat. And when I say, are you getting hit more with a bat? They're like, oh, absolutely. And Luke Maley was the first one to tell me, and others have kind of echoed it, is that it's the analytics. So when they're getting judged more and more every year for pitch framing, if they're basically catching a breaking ball, they're scooting up a couple inches in the box. So they're receiving that ball just in the corner of the zone versus out of the zone. But by moving up in the box, they're getting a little bit closer to the batter and kind of getting into the danger zone. So basically, that drop rig that I showed you, for years, they've been like, it's not really the right physics. You know, like, what that's simulating is you running out of the dugout, tripping, and then falling headfirst onto a bat that's lying on the ground. Mm-hmm. It's not the same as getting hit with a bat, and your head kind of keeps moving. So we said, well, let's see, like, again, because we care, let's see if our helmets are actually working in terms of a real bat hitting the head. Because the drop rig over there tends to favor really dense materials, like dense rubbers, dense vinyl nitriles, whereas the air cannon and 100 mile per hour impacts tend to be big and puffy. It tends to work really well. So we're like, are we using the wrong material, the wrong design to really do the best to manage the energy from a bat swing? So we basically built this thing called the bat swing. So this is our own thing. It's not required by any organization. It's just us going out, doing research on our own to really ultimately try to protect guys with that and to see, you know, how we can do it. So real simply, or I should say real simply, it's been fun, kind of building this because it was quite the process to swing it back at nearly 30 miles per hour. And now the computer's not behaving. Great. Super. So what I'm going to do is it takes a moment to load up the software, or load the code, but it's going to swing around and come and hit the head form, the velocity run, and let's see.
Now, all this stuff is super interesting. Like I said, I appreciate you sharing this with us. It's really cool. It's one thing to just see gear in the store and put it on, or watch guys wearing it on TV, but to kind of know the story about how it's created and why it's created and how it's tested. Really interesting.
Well, again, it really kind of comes back to us going to the players and just saying, hey, what's happening? And, how do we keep improving the product, making it better for you? So sorry, Zan, I need to restart the computer, wouldn't you know? Oh, there you go, it's better. All right, here we go. So without further ado, so we're loading the code. Oops. And the computer is misbehaving.
Well, hey, it wouldn't be a podcast if there wasn't some sort of technical difficulties, right?
I know, exactly. We have to have something that goes wrong. Give me 1 second to bring up the software again.
No problem at all.
And thanks to modern technology, we can also edit things since we're not live.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll load the software here. And we started this project with Worcester Polytech. It's a college down the street in Worcester. And then this past year, we had a summer intern basically elevate it to like a full-fledged piece of lab equipment that is great at basically getting repeatable results. It's just fantastic.
That would be an awesome internship. I imagine whoever you guys select, I bet they have a blast. And
absolutely. And it's something happens in. We're going to do this another time because it looks like the computer did something funky and deleted some of the code.
Well, hey, if we need to, we can always bring this back for an episode 2. And
I think we could probably do that. That's really interesting. I apologize. Computer snafu, but basically, it really actually, if you ever want to see, we do have some videos on Instagram, basically just showing this in action.
Sure.
Coming through, just whacking the head. And part of this is it's allowed us to explore, a lot of, other products too. Like this, the skull cap is not required to meet the NOxy standard. And when we developed this new the Axis skull cap, we augmented the shell by bumping it out a little bit around the edges, so we could fit a little more extra padding around here. And that, again, this is all like geared towards providing better protection against backswings. Mm-hmm. And that was really developed with this guy right here. It's like, what can we do to really optimize the performance of this helmet? Because really, this is specifically for absorbing, a side blow from a backswing. Sure. So again, just what are things that we can do to keep, moving the product forward, and just trying to advance it in incremental ways.
Let me ask you this. So, and again, I might be getting off on a little bit of a tangent too. With all this testing, I mean, the equipment you're showing, the processes, it seems like it could be an overwhelming process. When you're developing a new helmet or a new style helmet or a new product, how long do you think it spends in product development before it's actually released to the public?
So we have a new helmet that's coming out. It's called the MVP. Well, we used to call it the MVP 2020 because it was supposed to hit in 2020.
Yeah.
And it's not out yet. So really, it really depends. Typically, it depends on the product. So if it's a helmet, we're looking at 3 years. By the time from getting like ideation, like I bring sketches of line art, basically side views, front views of concepts, mm-hmm. of the shell, of the cage, show it to players. And this is, both major league players, minor league players. We have local colleges, we have local travel ball teams that we reach out to get their feedback. We might have like 6, 7, 8 designs. We kind of get the feedback, what people like and don't like, bring it down into like one design. And then we start a bunch of really fun things. Like Austin, who's an incredible industrial designer, will take those line arts, make a 3D CAD model. We'll take a look at it on the computer. It looks good. We've got a lot of history with our helmets. We know roughly the shell size for good fit, how much standoff we really need to do adequate protection. So we'll kind of build that on a framework, this new design. And then we've got our 3D printer, and we just start 3D printing. And so we'll make the shells up. We'll start lining that 3D printed shell with foam, put on people's heads, and say, hey, what do you think? And they might say, it's a little tight. It's a little too wide. We can go into the CAD, change it around, 3D print it again, and just go out and get more feedback. So it's a very iterative process. And that's really just to get the fit right. When it comes to the testing, that's a whole other thing that can take quite a bit of time, because we're trying to balance, trying to make something that's lightweight, so that because we don't want people to get tired over 9 innings, wearing a helmet. So weight is a definite factor. Price is a factor. We could use really expensive exotic materials, but then it'd be so expensive no one would ever buy it. So we're trying to have those competing factors, and then we're spending a lot of time in here. And there's some things I'd like to show you over here that you probably got a glimpse of, but like in terms of testing projectiles, there's an infinite number of locations you can hit a product, because you can spin the head all different ways, tip it different ways, rotate different ways. And so with our new helmet, we have like a checkerboard of basically locations, like a grid that we've impacted and inspected all of those locations. Like, basically mapped out the whole entire shell. That's a lot of work. It's just, adjusting the head form, collecting the data, do the data analysis. And then you might find that, oh, hey, we got a hot spot here. We're getting, we have a certain target we're trying to get the SI under. And if we're saying, oh, hey, it's like 200 SI here, we want to get it below that, then we start twiddling with things. Like, we start trying to be creative with different materials we have or different designs, come back in here and try it again, see if it works. It might be better, it might be worse. We learned something, iterate again. So again, it really can take quite a long time, to do it right. Because again, like, what motivates me is to know that at the end of the day, we got an extremely safe product that I can give to a pro player and know in confidence that it's going to protect them. And again, there's nothing that's concussion proof. Like, there's definitely certain limitations, but like, we've done everything within our ability before ever sees a real person. And the great thing on that new helmet, just kind of little teaser out there, we've had 9 people out in the minor leagues using it in August and September. And it was fantastic. They loved it. It fit great, super comfortable. Some guys commented like how they got, unfortunately, foul tips, because we haven't developed the force field yet. That's still in development. But to hear their feedback is phenomenal. And it's really gratifying when I say, okay, guys, the season's over, in a couple of days, can you send the helmets back to me? And they're like, do we have to? They want to keep them. Basically for winter ball and things like that. It's like, we got to take a look at them, because we learn a lot by seeing how it's been used in the field. So basically you should be seeing these pop up spring training, more or less. But it's been a good 3 years of just working on it, just trying to find, the right balance of materials and the right design, tweaking things ever so small. And we probably obsess over a lot of things, but that's what we do here. We just obsess over things.
Well, it shows in your work. That's why everything is, engineered specifically for catchers. And that's why, like I said, there's so many fans of all-star gear out there, from the helmets to the mitts to everything else. And that brings me kind of to my next point. We've been an entire podcast and we haven't spoken about, in my opinion, the best product you guys make, which is the catcher's mitt. So what I would like to do is I'd like to maybe bring you back for another episode where we talk just about the mitt, just about the training mitts, and we kind of go on that side of it. Because that's something that, like I said, I've used the mitt myself for a long time since I played, and recommend it to everybody, and everybody loves the training mitts as well. So maybe we have another hour and a half episode where we just talk about that.
Would love to. That'd be fantastic. Wonderful.
So yeah, Stan, man, I appreciate you doing this. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule and kind of clearing out the test lab for us and giving us the inside look. Really interesting, and just keep up the good work, man. You guys are doing fantastic. Like I said, you're definitely the catcher's favorite brand out there. So doing excellent things. No. Well, hey, man, I'm honored to have you on here and talk to you about it. And it's really cool to get the behind the scenes look. So I appreciate everything you guys are doing.
Well, likewise, Dan, keep coaching out there, keep the guys, just getting better and better. Love it. Fantastic.
You got it. Stan, man. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it. And like I said, I'm definitely going to talk to you about having you on for episode 2.
Awesome. Cool, man. Thanks.
Thanks.